Well, you all came because you wanted to be in a safe zone, right? I know what it's like to live on the left coast. I lived here for a number of years. I'm a graduate of USC. And in fact, I had my conversion to these ideas in Los Angeles, believe it or not. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that by way of introducing the theme, because I think if you can hang it on a story, if you can see its relevance to a person's life, the ideas that can otherwise sound so abstract and distant become more personal, more practical, and it gives us a way of thinking about the currency, the relevance of the ideas that we hold. We're not holding these ideas just because somebody gave them to us. We're holding them because we see them in 3 dimensions. We know that they work in our lives. How do we express them? All of us are frustrated with what's happening in our country today. The division among people, the rancor, the lack of real debate. You know, I really have to acknowledge this. I like a good debate. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. Every time we ate, there was a debate at our table. And what I don't like is what I see on television now is people talking from talking points, or just calling people names, or yelling over each other. And that's very frustrating because I like a good debate. And so I want to bring the case for a free society to you on the level of morality, on the level of what is right, what is good. The case for a free economy can very easily be made as a point of practical reason, as a point of history, as a point of what helps people to flourish, what enables the poor to rise from poverty. We see that on a practical level, on a utilitarian level. But the real thing that compels people aren't points of utility. People don't go to the barricades for a point of utility. They go to the barricades for a point of justice, for a point of what is right, for a moral argument. And that's what we need to bring to bear. You'll see that to the extent that the left has been successful in our society in this moment is because they're making moral arguments. Granted, they're superficial moral arguments. Granted, they are incorrect arguments. But nonetheless, they're appealing to people's sense of right. And that's what we need to do, a sense of justice, a sense of what is right. The left does not own the word justice. We own the word justice. So let me tell you what happened to me is in a very short way, how I came to be at this point in my life. As I said, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. It was a multi-ethnic experiment without the government mandating it. All you had to do was walk out your front door and you were in the middle of it. Chinese friend across the street who stereotypically enough had the audacity, whose parents had the audacity to run a laundry. The Polish plumber, I can't figure that one out. All my different Irish friends and black friends and Puerto Rican friends, and especially the Jews, I didn't know for the longest time that I wasn't Jewish. I knew that our kitchen smelt differently. And to this day, I can keep a kosher kitchen. There was, in our apartment, I grew up on Coney Island Avenue, which is not near the beach. The beach is 2 miles down that way. It was a congested Brooklyn big avenue with trolley cars and later buses. And it was a small apartment, probably a fourth the size of this stage. My parents had the front bedroom that looked onto Coney Island Avenue. This was before the invention of privacy. They didn't have a door on their bedroom. I had a little crib and then later a cot in the bedroom. They have to move it to get in the closet that was in that corner. My sister slept in the living room on the couch. My 2 brothers in a little broom closet of a bedroom on bunk beds, a little bathroom, and then a tiny little kitchen. You could barely move around in it. We didn't even eat in the kitchen. There was just one little table in there for breakfast. We ate in part of the living room. When you looked out our kitchen window, there was another apartment there, laid out just the same way ours was, in which lived Mr. and Mrs. Schneider. I remember one day, Mrs. Schneider, you could actually go out to the apartment. It was really a roof access, so you could go out and go up on the roof. But you could also go out and borrow something from a neighbor if you needed to. And Mrs. Schneider was there, and I remember it was a spring day. She was wearing a flowered dress. She had an apron on, and she was rolling some dough out as she was baking something. She was baking what are called rucola. Rucola are a kind of Eastern European pastry, delicious. She was mixing in the bowl some of the flour and the cinnamon and the raisins and the walnuts and a little bit of cream cheese, and she was mixing, did I say sugar? Sugar. Mixing all of this and then rolling out the dough, and then she would put the ingredients onto the dough, and she'd cut the dough into, basically she would form little croissants, and then she put the croissants on a cookie sheet, and she slid the cookie sheet into a green Wedgwood oven. She got that going, and then she went back and she was doing this again. And I am watching from my window, age 5 about, and that was my perspective. Watching Mrs. Schneider, I was mesmerized. She didn't say a word, she didn't look at me. She kept making this, and she put the tray of rucola in and pull a new tray out and tray of rucola in, and pretty soon the fragrance wafted across to my kitchen window, and I couldn't believe it. And finally at the end, she pulled the last tray out of that green Wedgwood oven, put it on the windowsill, and then she looked at me. She said, "You'll come, I'll give you to eat." And so I scampered off my windowsill, the few steps to hers, and I held out my greedy little hands. And she put a napkin over my hands, and she proceeded to place the rucola, the warm, luscious rucola, onto that napkin. And it was at that moment that I noticed on her forearm were a series of blue tattooed numbers. I had no idea what they meant. I had never seen them before. I have seen them subsequently. Growing up in Brooklyn in the 1950s, anyone has met people, or the parents of people, who had survived the Holocaust. And frankly, I was more concerned with my rucola, and I brought them into my kitchen and put them behind the bread basket to keep them away from my siblings. The Siricos had no dumb children. And then my mother came into the kitchen, and I said, "Mrs. Schneider gave me some rucola." She said, "Oh, good, good." And I said, "Why did Mrs. Schneider have numbers on her arm?" And my mother, who didn't, I don't know if she graduated 6th or 8th grade, gave me the most profound lesson in moral theology, politics, anthropology, you name it. It was all condensed in what she said to me. She said, "You know when you watch Saturday morning, you watch the Cowboys and Indians on television?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "What do the Cowboys do when they want to get their calves?" I said, "Well, they get on their horse and they lasso a calf, and then they jump off the horse and they tie it upside down." She said, "And then what do they do?" I said, "Then they take a branding iron and they brand the back of the calf." And she said, "Why do they do that?" I said, "So that tells every other cowboy who owns that calf." And my mother said to me simply, "That's what people did to Mr. and Mrs. Schneider." What more do you need to know about politics? What more do you need to know about anthropology? I knew it all right there. Look at how a child of 5 years old understood the natural law, understood the injustice of human beings being treated as though they were the property of someone else. I understood the whole thing, and my life went forward from that point to this point with that as the lens through which I see the social questions that confront us today. Now, that wasn't a straight shot from that moment to this moment, because there were many circumlocutions in my life, and I don't have lots of time to tell you about them all. But let me tell you what happened. By the time I reached my early 20s, this sense of injustice in the world, that people could treat people like animals, like they were the possession of someone else, had animated my activities. And I became involved in the left. Now, this is the early 1970s, late 1960s, early 1970s. And I hope that what I'm about to say and the people with whom I associated will not force an exodus from this auditorium tonight. But in those years, I was involved. If there was a social change movement, I was involved in it. If there was a picket line, I was picketing. If there was a sit-in, I was sitting. I was involved with all the social change movements of the day, the end of the anti-war movement, the beginnings of the feminist movement, the beginnings of the gay movement, the farm workers movement, the unions, the various kinds of union movements. And I was passionately driven by the notion that we had to create a just society. I remember once, I knew Jane Fonda and Tom Hayden. I remember one night, after we were registering people to vote. Some of you will remember when Tom Hayden ran against Tunney for the in the Democratic primary. I was involved with Fonda and Hayden at that time. I was helping Jane register voters. And we were in the back, so the evening was over in the back parking lot of the Gay Community Center in Hollywood. And early in the evening, when we were gathered, Jane didn't want to partake of the clove cigarettes that were being passed around the room. And so I handed her a joint. I said, "Here, Jane." She said, "Oh, Tom doesn't let me keep it in the house." I said, "Fine feminist you are." And she took it. And don't applaud that. Because now you go down to your grocery store and get it. I don't know. I'm not sure what California is up to these days. During this period of time, as I say, I was involved in all of these movements. I went to a friend's house in Hollywood, and just to see him, I don't remember what for, but I remember that there was a guy there who was a neighbor of his. And we came out, we talked with each other, we came out, was going to my car, and I noticed in front of my car was another car. But this car had bumper stickers on it, conservative bumper stickers. And I just made some snarky remark to my friend and his friend. And his friend turned to me and said, "Well, that's my car." I said, "Oh, yeah?" And I began, if you want to get to know me well, we begin with a fight, right? And we had this big argument for about 5 or 10 minutes. And when the dust settled, he said, "You are delightfully stupid." He said, "I'm going to educate you." I said, "Oh yeah, bring it on. I'll meet you argument for argument." And there ensued a great friendship. We began going out to dinner and having these arguments about every imaginable thing you can think of. And he said, "If I want to give you a book," I said, "Okay, you can give me a book. Can I give you a book?" He said, "Sure, I'll read it." Of course, most of the books I offered to give him he'd already read. But he gave me, over a period of time, Friedrich Bastiat's The Law. You young people need to read that book. It won't tell you what to think, it'll tell you how to think. It's a very simple book, very clear. Friedrich Bastiat, The Law. Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. Ludwig von Mises's Socialism, which was very difficult to read. I read Ayn Rand. I read Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom. I began to read all of these books and engage in these debates with this guy. Now remember, I'm away from my faith at this point. And as I read these books, it was like the light began slowly to come on in the room. And all of this furniture that I had bumped into, the social questions, the question of justice, became clearer to me, where everything was really situated and what it really looked like. I remember in one conversation, he said to me, "So you're passionate about justice?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Let's say you could reform society, the whole world. What would you do?" I said, "I would redistribute the wealth of the world." He said, "Okay, let's redistribute the wealth of the world. Let's imagine that today you have redistributed all of the wealth. Everyone has the same amount of money." He said, "Are you happy now?" I said, "Of course I'm happy now." I said, "More importantly, think of how many people are much happier now." He said, "Okay." He said, "What about the next day? What happens then?" I said, "Well, what do you mean what happens then? People go about their lives." He said, "Well, what do they do in going about their lives?" I said, "I don't understand." He said, "Well, where do they go? What do they do? How do they live their lives?" I said, "Well, they go to work." And he, stop there. "Where do they go to work?" I said, "Well, they go to jobs." I said, "What job?" He said, "What jobs?" I said, "Well, the industries." He said, No. You have redistributed all of the wealth of the world. I did, when I wrote my book, which has the same title as this lecture, Defending the Free Market, I actually did, it's very difficult to find out how much wealth there is in the world, by the way, but you have a basic idea. And I think the number I came up with was if you literally redistributed all of the wealth of the world, everyone would have about $6,000. Everyone, not every family, everyone. So for a family of 5 in some developing part of the world would be incredibly wealthy, whereas most everybody else would come down. And so I said, what do you mean they wouldn't have jobs? I don't understand. He said, he said, "I see your misunderstanding." He said, "You think the wealth of the world is held by this 1%. We didn't actually say 1% in those days. That's a relatively new thing. But the 3% or the 5% or whatever the percent is you want to direct your animus at. He said, "You think the wealthiest people in the world drive their money or wear their money or have it in their jewelry or have it in their houses or have it in their boats and their cars." He said, "In point of fact, what you don't realize is that the vast wealth of the world is not held in the toys of the rich, the richest. It's held in what's called investments. And what those investments are, I know I'm saying this to you, you all know this. That's industry, that's business, that's what capital is." You know, I had tried to read Das Kapital, chloroform in print. I was not an orthodox Marxist. I liked having my evenings free, you know, and what capital is different than property. Property, or the product, is the fish. Capital is the net. It's the thing whereby you can have property. It's the productive element of private property, and that's what Marx was after. The redistribution. He didn't care about your toothbrush. He cared about the factory that you may have owned or the bakery that you owned. And that's what he wanted redistributed. And when I saw this in this little mental game that this friend forced me to play, I began to see this interlinkage. Well, to make a very long story short, that illumination about economics caused me to think about the human person, because I came to understand that economics is not fundamentally about math or statistics. It's fundamentally about human action. It's fundamentally about human beings making decisions in an economic manner or on economic matters that benefit themselves and their families and society as a whole. And when I began to understand that, I thought to myself, especially with regard to the right to private property, what is it about the human person that gives us this right? And it was at that moment that my mind went back to the nuns in catechism who taught me first about God. Who made me? God made me. Why did God make me? God made me to be with him in this world and to be eternally happy with him in the next. I began to think more about the nature of the human person, the way in which human beings are corporeal, we are physical beings, we live in a material world, but we transcend our material capacities, right? Everyone knows this. Even unbelievers know this. Secular people understand this. Anyone who has experienced love, anyone who has experienced or defends a sense of honor, anyone who appreciates art or great music, recognizes the reality of human transcendence, that we would transcend our physicality, that there is something so valuable that it goes beyond the particular physical substance, and that part of human nature, this corporeal, the physical, and the transcendent, is what makes our relationship to this material world different than animals. Animals are bound to the material world by instinct. Humans are bound to the material world by our mind, by our reason. Human beings draw out of nature and create from nature that which did not previously exist. Silicon is sand, except now it's the basis of this communications revolution. Sand, the most ubiquitous substance on the planet. Oil, the same thing. When petroleum could be reconfigured to produce energy through the invention of the combustion engine and placed at the disposal of other people in what we call markets, it created the Industrial Revolution. This happens over and over and over again in human history, and I was just discovering it in my mid-20s. And what this economic discovery drove me to was a deeper contemplation on the nature of the human person, on the moral justice of human beings to be able to possess and create property. And in order to do this, they had to be free. Human beings draw from the natural resources. Natural resources are not wealth. If natural resources were wealth, Africa would be rich and Japan would be poor. Japan has no great amount of natural resources. Africa does. How do you account for that? Because the systems, the social and legal and political systems in Africa hold Africans back from being able to produce and create with their property and retain the right to their property. It is only when natural resources are transformed by human reason, by seeing things that other people need, sometimes long before they see that they need them, by seeing the use of things, by discovering things, this process we call entrepreneurship, that all of this, and placed at the disposal of other people in the community, is what we call a market economy, is what we call entrepreneurship, is what we call human prosperity. All of this began to fall into place. But even as it began to fall into place for me on an economic level, I kept hearing that nun and everything I had learned as a child about the scriptures come to the fore. After all, it was God who created what? The heavens and the earth, and pronounced the material creation good, and then forms man in the book of Genesis from the dust of the earth and breathes into him the breath of life, the physical and the transcendent. It began to correspond beautifully with my understanding now newly learned about how markets function and the right to private property. Something else, too, that religious people very often forget. They dismiss the importance of economics or the importance of a finance system or the importance of money or property or things like that. But what was the situation in which God placed man and woman in the Garden of Eden? And by the way, it was a garden, not a jungle. What's the difference? A garden is tended to. A garden is organized. A garden depends upon human labor. A jungle is wild. We are the stewards of creation. We are the co-creators with God. Not co-creators in the sense that we create from nothing the way God did, but co-creators in the sense that we collaborate with God in the ongoing work of creation itself. When all of these things began to come together in my mind, I bumped back into God. I won't go through all the details of going to a priest who came to me not because I called for a priest to make myself right with God, but because somebody introduced him to me because he thought, well, with an Italian name, maybe you'd have an affinity for a priest and you could take him out to dinner, because he had to get rid of him. And so the priest came to my house wanting to go out to dinner. I said, in Hollywood. I said, I'll take you out to dinner, but sit here in my kitchen. He sat down. I said, hear my confession. The poor guy was shocked. He was a Jesuit. He was a professor of philosophy. He didn't do pastoral work, but he said, well, okay, go ahead. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been 13 years since my last confession. He looked at his watch. I poured out my heart. I'm sure I mentioned Jane Fonda and the pot and all the rest of it, and a lot of other things that thankfully I don't have to tell you tonight, because I've been to confession, but I must admit I'm still doing the penance. This set me on a whole different course in my life. I don't know where I would be now if I hadn't read those books, if I hadn't thought deeply about those ideas, because that prompted in me not just a reconversion to my faith, but also a whole new way of seeing the way the economy functions, to come to understand and to realize that we're living at the most prosperous and liberal point in human history, liberal in the right sense of that word. It's another one of the words we need to have back in our vocabulary. They've stolen a lot of words from us. Justice, property, Madonna, gay. We can go on and on about the words that have been reappropriated and used to mean other things than they meant. But as I came to understand this and went to seminary and recaptured my faith, it redirected my life. Now, I went to seminary. Of course, in seminary, I bumped into a lot of people who were still enamored of Marx. At the time that I was in seminary, now the early 80s, there was this movement called Liberation Theology. Basically, liberation theology is the attempt to baptize Karl Marx. That's basically what it was. Just, let's create, there's just something people think, there's something so nice about Christianity, as though the purpose of Jesus coming to this earth was to be nice to us, right? He didn't. He came to condemn sin and to redeem sinners. That's why he came to this earth, not to be nice. Out of love, which is different than being nice. Love is sacrificial. Love is giving. Love is willing the good of the other. And when I came to understand all of this, it was then that I had to debate with my friends in seminary and say, no, your understanding of Christianity isn't socialism. You know what Winston Churchill said? He said, the Christianity, or the socialism of Christianity, said, what is mine is yours. The socialism of today says, what is yours is mine. Socialism isn't even social. It destroys societies. It destroys fraternity. What we need to do is recapture the moral language of the free society, to make freedom a noble and moral quest, a noble quest, once again. We have a lot of work to do, because even some of our conservative friends don't understand all of these things. We need to see the connection between the use of government power to advance even good things and how dangerous it is when we place that power in the hands. What Lord Acton said was, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. We need to understand that we can't achieve the good society by coercion. We have to achieve it by understanding the truth and by loving, by insisting on the truth of things. One of the greatest misunderstandings in our society today, and you hear it repeated over and over again, certainly by the left and this whole... By the way, I need to say that I am glad. Well, I was asked... I don't get into politics a lot because I'm not a political person. I'm not a member of the political party. Frankly, the Republicans are far more left-wing than I am. What we need to do is think of the good of society and the truth of what makes society works. But I was asked during the presidential primary in 2016 by a conservative radio talk show host what I thought of Bernie Sanders running. And I said, I was really glad that Bernie Sanders was in the race. He said, really? I said, Bernie Sanders, he said. I said, yeah. He said, why? I said, because finally we have a Democrat who admits that he's a socialist. And now the wonderful thing is that a lot of people following him. My friends, this is going to make our job much easier, because now we can finally say what socialism is and why it's wrong, why it doesn't work. Not that the people who advocate it necessarily are bad people. Some of them are good people. They're just wrong about how society functions. That you don't, you know Margaret Thatcher's great line. Yeah, socialism is fine until you run out of other people's money, right? And that's the thing. Or Bastiat said, I think this is where Thatcher got it from. Bastiat said, the state is the great myth whereby everybody thinks that they can live at everybody else's expense. Now, the danger in our society right now is we are coming to the point where there are more people employed or benefiting from the government than who produce. And it's not all that way yet, but it's going that way. And more importantly, there is an assumption that if something needs to be done, we need to get the government to do it. This is a deadly assumption because it destroys the fabric of community. It destroys society, and it dumbs us down. Why do I say it dumbs us down? Because when we're acting on behalf of people who have needs, we come to know them. We come to know what their real needs are. And when the government intervenes into that relationship, we no longer know what they need. So you give them one thing that they don't need, and then neglect or make impossible for them to obtain something that they really do need. And this brings me back to that question of the way in which even people who are productive in the market economy don't understand this philosophical basis of society and the importance of freedom. Because there are so many people who are in business who want to prevent other people from competing with them. And so what do they do to do that? Do they compete better? Do they produce a better product or one that's more attractive or cheaper or whatever? That's what an entrepreneur will do. No, what they do is they hire lobbyists. They go to Washington, D.C., and they convince politicians to either hinder their competition in one way or another, or enhance their productivity by subsidizing it or benefiting them in one way or another. This is what the left is constantly pointing to, rightly, and saying this is unjust, rightly, but calling it by a wrong name. They're calling that process what we call crony capitalism, state capitalism, capitalism, or the free market. The free market is not rapacious. Socialism is rapacious. This kind of fraternization, this friendships and nepotism that goes on that benefits people at the expense of other people, this is not what we are defending when we defend a free society. And all of this is a moral quest. You know, in terms of theology, one of the things that very good religious people make a mistake doing is, as the black preacher once said, they want to be so heavenly minded that no earthly good. And we think that, and in doing this, and thinking this way, we're very much like the socialists. We think all we have to do is intend for the good to happen. All we need to do is have good intentions. We don't. We need more than good intentions. We need to understand the practicalities of the real life. This, of course, is what's taught to us by manufacturing. This is what's taught to us by business. But let me put it in the words of a great philosopher. His name was Étienne Gilson, a French philosopher. He put it this way. He said, if you want to build a cathedral like Notre Dame, the facade of which represents the rising of the soul to God, you must first understand geometry. And then he said this needs to be on the door of every seminary in the country, in the world. Piety is never a substitute for technique. For without piety, without technique, piety is powerless to make use of nature for the glory of God. The importance of understanding how things physically connect, how they operate, how they work, is critical for the well-being of society. When God put man and woman in the Garden of Eden, he put them in the context of scarcity. They had to tend that garden. They had to work. Work didn't come as a result of sin. Work came from watching what God did. And then God told man and woman, work, be productive, be creative, be procreative, because that's the way in which we can renew the world. Lord Acton said one other thing. He said that liberty is the delicate fruit of a mature civilization. What we have inherited is the result of a process of deliberation and debate and contemplation and investigation and prayer over thousands of years. When I was living at a house once, it was 3 floors, and on the side of the house was an old tree. And I looked up at that old tree one day from the porch, and I saw that part of the tree was in bloom. It was green. And part of the tree was dead. The leaves were falling off. It was a huge tree. It went up higher than the 3 stories of the house. Now, what do I know from trees, right? I'm from Brooklyn. We had a tree there once. Somebody got it. Now, I looked at that, and then I discovered there's a thing called a tree doctor. And so I invited this guy to come, and he went around the tree, he looked at the bark, he looked at the roots, he looked at the leaves. He said, the tree's dead. I said, what do you mean the tree is dead? It's blooming. He said, no, it's an illusion. He said, the sap is going through the trunk of the tree, but the roots are already dead. The sap's just working its way out. He said, you leave it up here, year by year, it'll get deader and deader and deader. And the danger is, in a Michigan winter, it'll fall on the house. You got to take the tree down. I think that's a metaphor for where we're at in our society right now. I don't think the roots are dead. I think as long as there are groups like this and groups like that and families like that, that we have the chance to revitalize those roots, because we know that it's this biblical vision this classical vision of the dignity of the human person that is not given to them by any government or any vote, but comes with the very nature of the case, or as the Declaration puts it so poetically, endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights, not given to us by Congress, but by our nature. And when we understood that, we built institutions around that. The right to private property, systems of law, the rule of law, contract, a juridical framework that protected that essential dignity of the human person and the person's right to create and hold property. And over the centuries, that delicate fruit, under the care and keeping and tending of a mature civilization, produced this society in which we live today that remains delicate. Our commission, our obligation, is to protect the world from a system of ideas that would treat other people as though they were the property of other people. Whether you call it Nazism, National Socialism, Soviet Communism, or any of the other variety forms of collectivism, whether it's crony capitalism or big government bureaucracies that fail to allow communities to operate on an intelligent and compassionate way, these are the things we need to renounce. This falls to us now, in this generation, and in the next, because we don't know what will happen if our voices go silent. Thank you very much for your attention.
I'm sure you knew this one would probably be coming. A term we hear a lot is economic inequality. Is that immoral? And if we have it, does that make a society unjust?
Well, is economic inequality immoral? No, it is inevitable. Because, by the way, to go back to the question that friend put to me back then when we redistributed all of the money in the world. So he asked me, remember, what would we do? We'd redistribute the money, and what would happen the next day? And I said, I didn't know, and he said, well, you've redistributed all the businesses too. But what would happen the third day? Well, people would begin to trade. And in their trade, some people would trade better than others. They'd know more than others. They'd be more creative. They'd work harder, whatever it happens to be. And so on day 4, you would have economic inequality. That's what would happen. No, what we're concerned about is not inequality. I mean, really, in our great compassion, in our great fervor for justice, let us remember, first of all, that justice means treatment in accord with desert. In our great desire for this, we should not be concerned about the fact that some people have more than others. The fact that some people have more than others is not an indication of injustice necessarily. The question is how they got the more. But it does not, I don't lose a night's worth of sleep to think that Bill Gates has a lot more money than Warren Buffett. I don't think that that's unjust. Presuming that they're both operating in a free economy and they're doing things legally and honestly and all the rest of it. So it's not the gap between the rich and the poor that is the moral question. And it is not the ceiling that is the moral question. That is, should we put a cap on how much Bill Gates can own? I mean, if you understand economics and you understand that people in a free market only become wealthy because they're serving other people, because whatever product or service that they're putting out there, other people deem it important for them to have it and are willing to pay for it. And by the way, are willing to give their money because they would prefer to have that service or product. And then this person who provides that gets wealthier. there's nothing immoral with that. There might be a spiritual challenge if you have too much, and if you begin to worship it and begin to depend upon it, and all of the rest of that. That might be the case, but that's different. So it's not the ceiling, and it's not the gap. The moral question is the floor. The moral question is, how are the poorest people doing? And that we have the answer to. The whole world in the last 200 years, the poor have risen astoundingly from poverty. If you look at a graph of world population in terms of income and access to goods and resources, by every demographic analysis, we live in the richest age. We have the poor have risen out of poverty in all places in the world, except perhaps Venezuela, North Korea, Cuba, and therein lies a whole story. So we know how to create a society that produces wealth, that produces prosperity. And what we need to do is encourage other people to emulate the principles and the systems upon which that is based.
Thank you. Well, one of the most enjoyable things I get to do up here is as I take Q&A, and there are questions that come in that are similar, and you're all sort of differently, but you have the same thought. And this is probably the world's record today. Probably had maybe 20 cards come up, and 8 of them have to do with Pope Francis.
Oh, how did I know that was going to
happen? And they're all slightly different. I just want to give you, what do you think about our current socialist Pope? Could you please deliver these thoughts to the Pope?
Give me that.
I get.
Give me that. I want to bring it to the Pope when I get
yeah. But the best one is, how do you get him to think like you do? So if you could.
Well, I mean, I tried. There's a picture of me handing him a documentary series that we produced called The Poverty Cure. I see no evidence that he's viewed that yet. For you non-Catholics here, don't laugh too hard. Because in Catholic teaching, everybody thinks, by the way, thanks for Barbara Boxer, and I'll tell you why I say that. Because I testified before the Senate committee that she was the ranking member of, and she grilled me. You don't agree with Pope Francis, do you, on this, this, and this? By the way, I found out she was from Brooklyn. I wish I had realized that when we were talking. She kept calling me sir. I was going to stop her and say, Senator, it took me a long time to be called father. I say this to my shame because it didn't occur to me at the moment to do it. I would have been famous. Anyway, she kept driving home this point. The Pope is the Pope. And I said, well, first of all, you don't care that the Pope is the Pope because, you're cherry picking here. You agree with the Pope on abortion? You didn't want to go there. I said, but the Pope doesn't claim to be infallible on matters of economics or aesthetics or the lotto or any number of other things. He does not claim to be infallible on science or on economics. So he has an opinion on economics. And his opinion is as good as any other informed opinion on economics. It so happens that the Pope himself has said he has an allergy to economics. He doesn't understand it. I agree with the Pope. He doesn't understand it. Now, there are a lot of people who don't understand economics. How am I going to move him? I could give him that. And he's got a good heart. But when it comes to, feeding the poor, you have to know how to build bakeries, right? You have to know the technique. And what he's seen in terms of what business is, most all of his life, is Argentina, which is crony capitalism on stilts. So that form of fascist economic organization is not what we need. So, I'm a loyal son of the church. I'm a rather traditional Catholic. By the way, you didn't mention this in the introduction. I'm a full-time parish priest. I have a school in my parish, and there's beautiful things happening in there. We went from 68 students 7 years ago to now 335 students today. And one of the first things I did was I fired the public school teachers who inhabited our school. There was some agreement with the public school system where they could rent a classroom, and we had to agree to remove all of the religious symbols from the classroom, and I said, bye. And they went, and I stopped the hot lunch program because the kids didn't want to eat kale. And when we ended it, we saved $60,000. And I got into the pulpit the next Sunday, and I told the parish that I had made these decisions. I said, we're pulling a Hillsdale on them. And they applauded in my church. Now, we're not a Pentecostal church. We don't go around applauding in church. And they applauded in my church, so.
That's great. The next question deals with government oversight and the moral role in protecting its citizens, for example, or health by enforcing drug laws. Should that happen? And should the control of drug laws ban alcohol, tobacco, and sugar?
I'm not much impressed with the success the government has had on this whole drug thing. It's like, to use a different example, P.J. O'Rourke said, if you think healthcare is expensive, now wait until you see it when it's free. And I think this whole notion that we're going to control the drug problem by having a war on drugs is a misnomer. You look at the war on drugs, it parallels prohibition. Exactly. What we are doing is enabling, if you understand economics again, I wish I had more time to answer this question because it's an important question. What you're doing is incentivizing people. The cost of cocaine from the fields of Colombia, or wherever it's being produced now, Afghanistan, to the streets of New York is a 2,000% increase in profits. If I came to you and said, I have a stock, I'm telling you, 2,000% from now to the next quarter, would you invest in it? Of course you would. Would you invest if I told you it was drugs? No. Why? Because you have a life. You know morally, and you know just in terms of practicality, you get arrested, you be in jail. These kids who are being made that offer on the streets don't have a life. It doesn't mean anything to them. They don't see the future. That's the problem. I think we have to come at this thing in a whole different way. We need to launch a moral and spiritual crusade. The problem of drug abuse is a deeply spiritual problem that cannot be solved by putting people in jail, where, by the way, they can also buy drugs. So we have to come at this in a very different way, and this is absolutely very important, because this is the problem with some libertarians who make this argument. They say, oh, let people enjoy it, and they'll smoke, and as though drug abuse is okay, it's morally okay. I'm not saying that. I think that drug abuse, destroying your mind, destroying your body, is a horrible, horrible thing. You have obligations to your family, you have obligations to yourself, you have obligations to God. That's not my point. My point is we're fighting it in the wrong way. We need to fight it by having a moral understanding of what this problem is, and religious leaders should be the ones who lead that, because we are the ones who can offer spiritual liberation from this addiction.
That's an original answer. That's great. This next question is a sort of technical and very, should be very quick. The book, The Law, that we didn't catch the author.
B-A-S-T-I-A-T, Bastiat. And I suppose that you can download that from the internet. If not, By the way, I invite everybody to leave their names and addresses or emails because we have a lot of information from the Acton Institute, but we can get you one. If you want to order a copy of the law from the Acton Institute tonight, just let him know. We'll send it to you, and I don't know, it's like a few dollars. It's a little bitty book.
This next question is a little timely because the issue bubbles up every now and then. We haven't heard it for a while, and now it's back. Reparations. Would you like to discuss the moral case for reparations and impact? And
You know, I think this is an enormously complex issue. I mean, putting aside who gets the reparation, right? I mean, who gets it? Then you have to ask the question, who pays it? I mean, which means you. Oh, yes, I see, yeah. But if the Democrats are going to pay it today, you're going to be paying it. So, no, I think, let me say this. When people have their property taken from them, especially the property in their person, some reparation needs to be made for something like that. The schemes that are coming up now, I don't even know what they are. If we are repairing people, paying people from people who had nothing to do with it, that's unjust. And if you are paying people who simply because they, I imagine that President Obama wouldn't get a dime, right? Mm-hmm. His family was never a slave. Mm-hmm. Maybe he would have to pay reparations because I don't know what his ancestors did, right? So you got to think about that. So this is a very complex, I don't think it should just be dismissed out of hand because the moral premise, if the moral premise of the argument is people have had their property taken away from them and they should have it restored to them, we have to figure out how we do it because that's exactly what we're talking about with people who survived the Holocaust. It's what we've been talking about for a long time with people who had their property confiscated from them under the Soviet regime. But there are ways that repair by endorsing and recognizing the sanctity of private property, and there are ways of paying reparations that replicate the injustice that was done in the first place. And I think at least what I'm hearing from Cory Booker is something that would replicate the injustice rather than repair the injustice. So I don't want to dismiss it out of hand, though I would dismiss probably 99% of the proposals that they're going to come up with because I know them well enough. I know exactly what they're going to do. This is just another redistribution of the wealth scheme. That's not what I'm interested in. If you can trace your heritage back and you've been disabled in some way, there should be some reparation, and I think also, if we're going to be fair about this, we have to calculate into this whole thing the fact that you have grown up in a country that has lifted your life to a greater extent than probably anywhere else that you would have lived on the earth, which doesn't in any way justify slavery in the first place, because slavery is socialism.
this was an interesting question. This sort of it might be anecdotal, but someone had the experience where they wanted to do voter registration in the church, and the pastor said, well, God is in control. So I think if I'm interpreting this correctly, it was sort of anti-vote. Why would you bother? Because God is in control. Do you feel, is that a thread that you sometimes see in the religious community, or was this just a one-off?
Well, I think there are a lot of pastors who are very nervous, and it's not just on politics. They're nervous to say anything about morality, at least some of them. I mean, some of them are. I'm talking about Catholic priests. They're very nervous to preach because, and let me just not dismiss it too easily, because the difference with Catholic priests and Protestant pastors is that Catholic priests spend a lot of time hearing people's confessions. So, and I know Protestant ministers do counseling and stuff like that, but not at the rate and the intensity I mean, I don't know how many confessions I hear a week. And when I'm standing in the pulpit and I'm looking around and I mention adultery, I say, well, let me talk about homosexuality. Let me talk about contraception. No. So there is this natural, you want to be very, very judicious in how you say it, but that does not exempt me from proclaiming the truth. And so you have to find a way to be loving, to be what Jesus was with this woman who was caught in the act of adultery, right? 99% of that text has Jesus protecting her. He's stopping her from getting stoned, right? And finally, when he turns to her, he says to her, "Where have your accusers gone?" And she says, "Lord, they've left." He said, "Neither do I condemn you. But go and sin no more." That makes the whole text. That makes the whole passage. That has to be part of our proclamation, that Christ loves us in the face of our sin. And so I think when pastors are afraid to bring in politics, they figure, there's nothing I'm going to gain by this. They can go and register somewhere else. But by the way, this is not the same as endorsing a particular piece of legislation. This is not the same as endorsing a politician. Voter registration is perfectly legal in a nonprofit 501c3 church. It's perfectly legal to do that. So they shouldn't be afraid of it. And if somebody wanted to do it, as long as they're not filling in, like I remember one guy back in those days when I was registering people for Jane Fonda, one of the guys would fill in the party affiliation before. We said, "You can't do that." He said, "Shh, shh." It was Democrat. Was. I'm sure I'm outside the statute of limitations on that one, but I wasn't doing that anyway.
This next comment builds on something we hear a lot from a speaker we had a couple months ago, Dennis Prager, and that's how people who
also from Brooklyn.
Oh, that's right. So they're people who are they're consider them secular, but their liberalism or their progressivism is their new religion. Maybe a couple comments on that.
Yeah, it was Tocqueville. Let me see if I can remember how he put this. It's beautiful. In Democracy in America, Tocqueville said, to the extent that the moral tie is weakened in society, the governmental tie will be strengthened. And as churches have ceded their role in society more and more to the government, or as government has taken more and more of the church's role, by that I mean orphanages and soup kitchens and hospitals and all of the rest of the social infrastructure, the schools and all the rest of it. As the government has taken that, the moral voice has grown weaker and weaker. And it's not like, what did Chesterton say, that a non-belief in God doesn't mean that you don't believe anything. It believes you'll believe anything. And I think this is what's happening in society, so that it is not the case that liberals don't judge people. That's the big thing they say about Christianity. Don't judge me. You have no right to judge me. Who are you to judge me? You can't judge me. As though the liberal posture is, we don't judge people. We just don't judge people. Light up a cigarette and see if you don't get judged. I walked in the room, several people wearing MAGA hats. I said, "Boy, you're brave." Wear a MAGA hat in California, no less. I mean, when I put my collar on today when I was in San Francisco, I wondered what was going to happen. Things like that. But no, I think it is the case that when you don't have a reasonable moral structure, you become more intense on secular things, and secularism becomes a religion, and it's a far more exacting and demanding religion than Christianity in a way.
Yeah, we'll do a couple more. Would you like to have a few comments on Venezuela and what's happened there? That's been in the news.
Well, I've been to Venezuela a number of times, not recently, because I was going to go down to Venezuela, and the bishops were encouraging me. We have a meeting with some of the bishops in Venezuela. They said, "Come down. You'll be safe. We'll take care of you." And I'm an Italian citizen as well as an American citizen, so I could travel on an Italian passport, so the Venezuelan government wouldn't know that I was an American. Although if they Googled my name, I'd be in trouble. But they said, "Come down, you'll be safe." And so I was thinking about going down there, and the week later, one of the bishops was arrested. So I said, no. What we did was we brought people to an Acton conference outside of Venezuela, and we have Venezuelan students who come to our Acton University. You really have to go on our website and see the kinds of conferences that we have. It's really incredible. Venezuela is sitting on the largest reserve of oil in the world. There is no excuse. And all of these people, like Bernie Sanders, like Sean Penn, like who else? What's the name? Glover, and these other people who are trying to back away from, no. They say, no, this isn't socialism. Yes, these people take socialism seriously. And that's why you've got what you've got in Venezuela right now. So what has to happen, of course, as you know, the legal process has now recognized the presidency of an interim president. What needs to happen is the military needs to just say, and I don't think it needs to be any bloodshed. They just need to say, we're not protecting you anymore. And he'll go. He'll go, because I got news for you. His family has millions and millions of euros, I'm told, including in the Vatican Bank, which I have reported. So I think that's what needs to happen. It's a terrible, terrible situation there, and the people of Venezuela are wonderful people, cultured people. When I was there, I enjoyed my visits. I was even there under Chavez, but it's gone too far, and I think we need to make known that this is the end result of socialism.
Okay, to wrap us up on a happy note, we've been all around this tonight, but it's a couple comments about why is socialism so popular, with the examples of North Korea and Venezuela still sort of lives on, and what's a couple things we can do about the future that you could be optimistic about?
Well, why is socialism popular? It's popular because people don't think. They don't, and if you don't believe me, I refer you to the comment section of almost any blog on the internet. I am amazed. I read these comments in various places and think to myself, I'll bet this person has a car. They drive. Imagine a person that stupid in charge of 2 tons of metal. It's just amazing. So that goes into the second question. Well, of course, people, it feels good. So socialism just feels good. You know, I mean, it's social. You want to help people, right? You know, if you're not a socialist when you're young, you have no heart. If you remain a socialist when you're old, you have no brains. So what do we have to do? We have to do what these kids are doing, what that family is doing, what you are doing right here tonight, and what you are probably all doing in your own way. You need to read. You need to debate. By the way, here, I will never be invited back now. You need to read the New York Times. You need, I every morning wake up to National Public Radio, and not just because it's Lent. Because when you, I promise you, I was talking to Isaac, I promise you, he says it's good for me because I'm having this constant debate in my head as I'm listening to them report. No, that's not quite right. Yeah, that's good. That's a good bit of information. Oh, but that's put in a different context. You're constantly debating. You're sharpening your mind. No, this is the old Jesuit, when the Jesuits were Jesuits, the old Jesuit way of going about it was know your opponent's argument better than your opponent knows it. read their arguments. Know the way they think, because what will happen over time is you will understand how to persuade them to the truth. And maybe you'll do it a little more lovingly, a little more winsomely. Try this for the remainder of Lent. I think we have 10 days left to Lent, something like that. Try this. Say whatever you want to a liberal, but do it with a smile. Just try that for the rest of Lent. Happy Easter.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Father Robert Sirico.